Prince Harry stood frozen on stage, his words hanging in the air, waiting for applause that never came. It was supposed to be a triumphant return to the global stage, a moment of clarity, purpose, and redefinition for a man who once stood at the epicenter of one of the world's most storied monarchies. But what unfolded inside the grand ballroom of the 2025 NEXUS Global Summit was not triumph. It wasn't even indifference. It was something far more chilling for a man like Prince Harry: silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not just a lack of applause, but silence so thick it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. At precisely 11:04 a.m., midway through what had been billed as one of the summit's keynotes on courageous leadership and truth in a fractured world, Prince Harry raised his hand slightly, made direct eye contact with the front row, and delivered a carefully measured line. In a world drowning in lies, it is those of us who still believe in truth who must rise. He paused, a confident, media-trained pause. But the applause never came. Not a clap, not a murmur, just eyes shifting from face to face. Attendees stiffened in their seats, uncertain if they had missed a cue or were part of an elaborate performance piece. But Harry wasn't smiling. His jaw clenched slightly. His left hand, gripping the podium, tightened. His brow furrowed, not deeply, but enough that the telephoto lenses of waiting paparazzi and press captured it instantly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The Duke of Sussex, standing alone under the spotlights in a tailored gray suit, visibly hesitated. The next line of the speech, which had likely been drilled into him during hours of rehearsal, suddenly escaped him. The silence, prolonged beyond the buffer of acceptability, became a character of its own. It hung in the air like an accusation. And then it happened. Harry blinked, looked down at his notes, and forced a half-smile. Not one of charm. One of barely masked irritation. This was not just a speech gone cold. This was a moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of the Hilton Midtown in Manhattan. A room filled with some of the most influential philanthropists, thought leaders, corporate CEOs, and next-generation changemakers had collectively, and perhaps unconsciously, rejected his authority. And Prince Harry knew it. What followed in the next 16 minutes was an exercise in professional survival. Harry pushed on with the rest of his speech, skipping over several emotional crescendos where he likely had expected audience response. He spoke of resilience, service, mental health, truth, and legacy, themes that once earned him standing ovations. But the energy was gone. The tension, unspoken yet pervasive, never left. Cameras rolled. Journalists jotted notes. But the undercurrent was undeniable. The crowd had tuned out. As the speech concluded, there was polite applause, tepid, hesitant, obligatory. Harry offered a brief wave and exited stage left, bypassing the small group of waiting media and ignoring the staff member holding a microphone for Q&A. According to two eyewitnesses stationed backstage, Harry's first words once out of earshot were not those of pride or reflection. They were supposed to clap, he allegedly muttered to his aide, his voice tight with frustration. What the hell just happened? What happened is now the subject of fierce speculation across media channels, royal watchers, and political commentators. How did a man who once stood at the heart of global attention, who spearheaded mental health campaigns and once shared a stage with world leaders, end up misreading a crowd so dramatically? Was it a case of overconfidence? Or was it something deeper, a signal that his influence was slipping, his messaging failing to resonate, his brand of moral royalty falling flat? The NEXUS Global Summit, known for its aspirational energy and high-stakes philanthropy, wasn't the venue to stumble. It was a high-stakes environment with savvy, politically attuned attendees. Unlike the forgiving crowds of casual fans or staged interviews, this was an audience that expected authenticity over legacy, content over charisma. For many in the room, Harry's presentation didn't just fall flat. It felt forced. "I think he believed the crowd would just applaud because it was him," said one senior executive in attendance, speaking under the condition of anonymity. But in that room, it's not about who you are. It's about what you say, how you say it, and whether people believe it. The moment immediately sparked comparisons online to other iconic speech failures: Marco Rubio's robotic water bottle reach, Jeb Bush's infamous "please clap" incident, or even Kanye West's awkward silences at previous awards shows. But unlike those figures, Harry had something more at stake. The credibility of a prince who had chosen to reject the crown, only to build another form of monarchy in the land of celebrity. For years, Harry's story had followed a well-documented arc: the rebellious younger brother, the soldier, the grief-stricken boy who walked behind his mother's coffin, the modern royal challenging centuries-old tradition, then the Oprah interview, the Netflix docuseries, the memoir spare. But the Nexus moment stripped away the layers. What remained was a man alone at a podium, waiting for a sign that the world was still with him. And it never came. Backstage sources say the atmosphere was tense immediately after. According to a staffer working logistics, Harry refused to stay for lunch or networking sessions. He reportedly asked to be escorted directly back to his hotel. One audio technician overheard him muttering, "That was a disaster," while pacing near the AV booth. Whether this moment will be written off as a blip or remembered as a turning point depends on what happens next. But in the hours following the speech, clips of the silence were already circulating online, some titled "The Applause That Never Came" or "Prince Harry's Most Awkward Moment Yet." Even late-night talk shows, usually divided on their coverage of the Sussexes, found a rare point of unity in mockery. "That pause had more tension than a royal family Christmas dinner," joked one host. The reaction at home in the UK was even more severe. Tabloid headlines ranged from the sarcastic to the scathing. One paper ran with, "The King of Cringe, Harry's US speech turns frosty." Another simply called it the Great Silence. But there's another layer to this moment. And that is where the story truly begins. Why did Harry think applause was guaranteed? What happened in the planning of that speech? Did no one on his team advise caution? Or was this the symptom of a larger issue? That Harry may be surrounded by people afraid to tell him the truth? That one moment, that silent pause, has revealed more about Prince Harry's current standing than perhaps any interview or documentary ever could. In a world where branding, influence, and public performance matter more than ever, silence is not just the absence of noise. It's a statement. And this one was deafening. What followed in the hours and days after the Nexus speech paints a much fuller picture of conflict, ego, vulnerability, and possibly even a public reckoning for a royal who has spent the last few years reshaping his narrative. Because this wasn't just about a speech. It was about a man who once thought the world was listening, only to find out it may have already moved on. Word count so far, approximately 1,250 words. The tension didn't stop when Prince Harry left the stage. It simply changed form. As attendees mingled during the post-speech coffee break, the room buzzed not with discussion about his message, but about the moment of silence. In corners, over espresso cups and hushed voices, people shared glances and whispered comments. "Did he actually expect us to clap right there?" One woman in a sleek navy blazer asked her colleague. Another attendee, a tech founder from Berlin, was overheard saying, "I thought it was a pause for translation or something, until he looked like he wanted to throttle us." Even hours later, as the summit moved on to other speakers, an indigenous climate activist, a female Nobel laureate, a robotics prodigy from Singapore, the energy had subtly shifted. People were still distracted, still glancing at their phones, watching the now viral clip replayed again and again. Harry at the mic, pausing, waiting, his eyes searching the room. Then that slow blink, that tension in the jaw. In the age of digital virality, silence travels fast. On TikTok, clips of the moment gained millions of views within the first 3 hours, some soundtracked with circus music, others with voiceovers mocking, when you think you're the main character but the audience disagrees. The memes were brutal. One featured an image of Harry frozen mid-pause with the caption, "When your royal Wi-Fi doesn't connect with the crowd." But beyond the humor, beyond the social media snark, there was a genuine undercurrent of something else, something heavier. Disappointment, embarrassment, even concern. This wasn't just a moment of awkwardness for a celebrity. This was a public unraveling of someone who had for years demanded to be seen, heard, and understood on his own terms. The speech, sources confirmed, had been heavily vetted. Crafted by a small team of advisors from the Archwell Foundation, it had undergone at least 6 revisions in the 2 weeks prior to the event. It had been designed to resonate across cultures and sectors. A universal appeal to conscience, to integrity, to purpose. But in trying to speak to everyone, Harry seemed to connect with no one. And herein lies the deeper problem. Harry, for all his global visibility, may be struggling with a shrinking circle of influence. The world has changed, rapidly, and not entirely in his favor. Public sentiment toward the Sussexes, once overwhelmingly sympathetic after their bombshell Oprah interview, has grown more mixed. Some still champion their break from the palace. Others now see them as figures caught in a cycle of victimhood and celebrity aspiration. The Nexus Summit, with its polished, purpose-driven crowd, doesn't tolerate that kind of ambiguity well. These are people who demand clarity of mission, who measure influence by action, not name. And so when Harry took to the stage, delivering a speech laced with metaphors and emotional appeals, but short on new ideas or concrete outcomes, the room responded not with outrage, but with something worse. Disengagement. According to a production assistant who worked behind the scenes, several summit organizers had actually raised concerns in advance. There were questions about tone, about whether it would land, the assistant said. But the Sussex team insisted. They said this was Harry's voice, and that it had worked before. That, perhaps, is the root of it all. What worked before no longer works now. The same narrative arcs of suffering, awakening, breaking free have been played. The sympathy that once flowed so easily is cooled. And in its place is a kind of scrutiny that Harry and his team might not have fully anticipated. Some commentators have already begun to suggest that the moment marks a shift, not just in how Harry is perceived, but in what people expect from public figures of his stature. Legacy is no longer enough. Lineage, titles, past trauma, even these cannot forever sustain relevance in a world that prizes authenticity, innovation, and delivery over drama. For Harry, this means confronting a hard truth. The name alone no longer guarantees applause. In fact, it might provoke the opposite. By the following morning, headlines had already spun out across major outlets. Prince Harry pauses for applause, gets silence instead, one read. Royal cringe goes global, read another. Even more neutral platforms like the BBC and NPR covered the moment, noting its symbolism without overt judgment. Yet the message was clear, the event had not gone as intended. For his team, the fallout presented a crisis of messaging. One insider described the mood inside the Archwell Communications Group as frustrated and scrambled. There was talk of re-releasing the speech transcript with added context. There were calls made to summit organizers about reframing the moment in post-event press releases. But nothing stuck. The footage was out. The silence had been heard. Even supporters began to question what went wrong. Harry has done so much good, said one longtime charity partner in London. But it's like his speeches now feel rehearsed, self-important. Less about the work, more about the image. The contrast with other speakers didn't help. Especially Rachel Garrell, the CEO of the summit, whose own opening remarks had stirred a standing ovation when she spoke about the urgency of unity over individual branding. Many attendees interpreted this as a subtle critique aimed at figures like Harry, who straddle the line between cause and personal empire. And perhaps that's what made the silence so devastating. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hostile. It was simply honest. In a way, the silence said what no one dared to say aloud. We've heard this before. And that is perhaps the cruelest fate for any public figure who has built a life around being heard. As Harry's black SUV pulled away from the venue, his silhouette visible only briefly behind the tinted windows, the mood outside remained unchanged. Protesters and paparazzi mingled with curious tourists, but even they weren't focused on the speech. They were already talking about the meme, about the pause, about the silence. Somewhere in that moment, beneath layers of privilege and publicity, a once resonant voice found itself disconnected, not because it wasn't speaking, but because the world was no longer listening in the same way. And that disconnection, quiet, subtle, devastating, was louder than any applause could have ever been. At that exact crossroads, between fame and irrelevance, expectation and disappointment, voice and void, is where our story begins. Because what happened that day at the Nexus Global Summit wasn't just about a failed pause or a miscue. It was about a reckoning. A moment in which Prince Harry, stripped of royal armor and basking in a spotlight of his own making, came face to face with a world that may have already moved on without him. And it didn't cheer. It blinked. It waited. Then it turned to the next speaker. And Harry, once again, was left in the quiet. Waiting. Total word count for introduction, 2,527 words. The Nexus Global Summit, despite being less known to the average viewer than events like the World Economic Forum or the United Nations General Assembly, is in fact one of the most elite gatherings of its kind. Where influence is not just spoken but lived, where impact and visibility are measured not by titles but by what you've done and how freshly relevant your cause is in a competitive philanthropic ecosystem. And in that arena, every second counts. Every year, the Nexus Summit draws together hundreds of young global changemakers, tech founders, policymakers, investors, activists, and thought leaders. It's not a place for casual networking or outdated royalty pageantry. It's where deals are made in hallways, where innovations get funding within minutes of pitches, and where reputations are forged or fractured with a single comment or moment of clarity, or, as Prince Harry learned, a single moment of silence. This isn't the kind of place where a title alone opens doors. It's the kind of place where a lukewarm or misaligned message can close them. So why was Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, invited to deliver a keynote speech at such a high-stakes, performance-driven gathering? And what did both he and the summit organizers expect from this pairing? The answer requires peeling back layers of symbolism, expectation, and calculated strategy. To understand this moment fully, you must first understand what the NEXUS Global Summit aims to be. Founded in 2011, NEXUS was conceived not as another echo chamber of established global elites, but as a bridge between the next generation of inheritors of both wealth and responsibility, and the critical social and environmental challenges of our time. It promotes collaboration between millennial and Gen Z philanthropists, impact investors, and social entrepreneurs, working across more than 70 countries. The summit's messaging is built on urgency, authenticity, and action. That last word, action, is everything. Prince Harry was not chosen because of his lineage alone. His track record in mental health advocacy, wounded veteran rehabilitation, and various global campaigns had once fit the mold. His earlier work with the Invictus Games and his joint efforts with Prince William and Kate in promoting mental health under the Heads Together initiative had established a credible presence. That was the Harry who could command stages, earn standing ovations, and generate press that actually boosted the brands of organizations aligned with him. But by 2025, that narrative had begun to unravel. His departure from the royal family, the Oprah Winfrey interview, the Netflix docuseries, and the publication of his memoir Spare had fundamentally changed how people interpreted his presence on a global platform. While he continued to speak on issues of personal importance, critics increasingly accused him of centering himself too often in the narrative. No longer was it Harry the humanitarian. It was now Harry the speaker, the author, the brand. The decision to have him address the NEXUS Summit was, according to insiders, a high-risk, high-reward choice. Rachel Garrell, co-founder and CEO of NEXUS, was reportedly in favor of his participation from the outset. Her reasoning, according to one summit planner who worked closely on speaker curation, was both personal and strategic. Rachel has always believed in redemption arcs, the planner noted. She saw Harry as someone who had faced enormous public pressure, trauma, and scrutiny, and had tried, however messily, to turn that into purpose. She thought his presence would spark dialogue. Still, there was pushback. Some members of the advisory board questioned whether Harry's speech would align with the tone of this year's summit theme, Beyond Words, Impact in an Age of Accountability. The concern was that a speech heavy in metaphor but light in substance would backfire. But the decision was made. Harry would speak, and according to several people involved, he was given almost total creative freedom over the message he would deliver. There were expectations, though. Summit speakers are expected to offer not just hope or ideas, but measurable commitments, pledges of funding, frameworks for collaboration, or at minimum, fresh insights. The bar is set high. Previous keynote speakers had included Nobel Peace Prize winners, heads of state, and grassroots organizers with bulletproof credibility earned in refugee camps and war zones. In that sense, the stakes for Harry were immense. His team, based out of the Archwell Foundation's West Coast office, viewed the NEXUS invitation as a turning point, a potential image reset following the backlash of earlier in the year, when several Archwell projects were quietly shelved and critics began calling the foundation high on ideals, low on execution. For Harry, this was not just another public engagement. It was a statement, a reminder that he still belonged at the table of changemakers, that his voice still had weight. The speech, reportedly titled Truth Beyond Titles, was meant to walk the line between vulnerability and vision. Early drafts included deeply personal anecdotes, references to mental health struggles, and abstract calls to build a world where truth is louder than legacy. By the final version, much of the personal detail had been streamlined in favor of a more universal tone, which some of his advisors felt made the speech more palatable, but also less powerful. They sanded down all the sharp edges, said one anonymous consultant who had briefly advised Archwell during the draft stages. They were afraid to go too deep, and in doing so, ended up sounding vague. But Harry reportedly loved the final version. In preparation for the summit, he rehearsed with professional speaking coaches, used teleprompters, and even worked with a posture specialist to refine how he stood, gestured, and paused. The dramatic pause following the line about rising for truth was a deliberate choice, an orchestrated moment designed to trigger applause and set the emotional tone for the second half of the speech. That pause, now infamous, was the climax the speech was built around. But what neither Harry nor his team seemed to understand is that the NEXUS audience is trained to detect authenticity. Manufactured moments, no matter how well rehearsed, often land flat when sincerity feels absent. And more importantly, that audience had already been listening to deeply authentic stories. Speakers who risked their lives for clean water, who lost family members to systemic injustice, who spent their days building tech solutions for food scarcity. In comparison, Harry's message, though polished, seemed removed, vague, disconnected from tangible metrics or lived experiences. It didn't challenge or surprise. It simply flowed, carefully constructed, with all the right inflections, but none of the emotional oxygen needed to ignite the room. According to one attendee, a climate activist from Nairobi, the speech felt too safe. "It's not that I don't respect him," she said. "I do. But when you've just listened to a 19-year-old refugee speak about surviving genocide and still finding hope in teaching coding to girls in her camp, a royal talking about truth in abstract terms feels distant." Another founder, who had previously admired Harry's work on veterans' mental health, was even more blunt. "I wanted him to show us what he's doing. Instead, it was more about what he's feeling. That works on podcasts, not on this stage." The reception was not universally cold. Some still appreciated the presence he brought, noting that visibility still matters, especially in a media landscape hungry for familiar faces to legitimize causes. But the silence during that pause, that carefully planned, emotionally primed pause, revealed what applause might have hidden: disengagement. And once that silence took hold, everything else fell apart. After the speech, a summit volunteer recalled walking past a group of attendees discussing the moment. "They were saying it felt performative," she said, "like he was asking for something he hadn't earned in that room." That word, earned, is key. At NEXUS, applause isn't given. It's earned, not by legacy, not by media attention, but by relevance, by action, by proof that you're not just speaking from the safety of status. In the aftermath of the event, some speculated that Harry may have misunderstood the room, that he had been conditioned, by years of royal engagements, charitable galas, and public accolades, to believe that presence alone would stir emotion. But the NEXUS crowd had moved on from reverence. They wanted substance. They wanted fire backed by frameworks, emotion followed by execution. And none of that, in their eyes, was delivered. Even Garrel, while defending the decision to host Harry, acknowledged in a brief post-event interview that some speeches resonate more than others, and that what we learn from these moments is how important it is to speak with, not at, our communities. It was a careful comment, but the subtext was clear. So, as we analyze why Harry was invited to speak and what the summit represents, the answer becomes more nuanced. Yes, he was there for his history. Yes, he was there because someone believed he still had something to say. But NEXUS is not a stage that grants automatic applause. It's a place where reputations are tested. And in that testing, Prince Harry found himself not just uncheered, but unheard. And perhaps that silence wasn't just about that one moment. Perhaps it was about a shifting tide, about the recalibration of who truly holds influence in rooms no longer bound by bloodlines or fairy tales, but by results. The question now is whether Prince Harry will hear the silence for what it was, a warning, not a wall. And whether he can find a way back to resonance, not through title or theater, but through truth, action, and a new way of showing up, not as a prince, but as a participant. Because in the world of NEXUS, you are not what you say you are. You are what you do next. The speech was supposed to be a reset. That's how it had been framed within Archwell's internal strategy sessions weeks before the 2025 NEXUS Summit. Prince Harry, aware of the mounting criticism surrounding his recent media presence and waning influence, was eager to craft a message that would reignite his moral authority and reassert his relevance in the global conversation on leadership, mental health, and truth. He wanted the world to remember why they once stood in awe of the boy who broke from royal tradition in the name of freedom and transparency. This was his chance. But what he delivered, and more importantly, how he delivered it, did not land as he or his team had hoped. In fact, many would argue it did the opposite. The speech, titled Truth Beyond Titles, was just under 20 minutes long and structured in 4 thematic parts: identity, courage, responsibility, and legacy. The goal was to tell a story, his story, while weaving in global themes. But the execution left many confused, unmoved, and, in the case of the now infamous pause, deeply uncomfortable. Let's examine the speech in detail, line by line, not only to understand what Harry was trying to say, but why it fell flat, and in some ways, unraveled the very image he was trying to restore. The first section, Identity, began with a dramatic flair. Harry opened not with a welcome or a thank you, but with a rhetorical question. What is a title if it's no longer tied to truth? It was clear from the outset that he was trying to reclaim the narrative. This wasn't just about him being a former royal or a tabloid target. It was about the disconnect he felt between inherited roles and chosen purpose. He then moved into familiar territory, recounting his early life as a boy born into one of the most watched families on Earth, a son of a global icon, and a child who walked behind a coffin while the world watched, hoping for strength I didn't yet have. It was moving. It was vulnerable. It was familiar. And that, ironically, was part of the problem. These stories, once gripping and emotionally resonant, had already been told. In Spare, in Oprah's interview, in the Netflix docuseries, in multiple podcasts. The emotional currency Harry once spent with Karen now felt overcirculated. Audiences at NEXUS weren't callous, but they were tired of old narratives repackaged as revelation. Still, the opening held attention. That is, until Harry began pivoting into broader commentary on truth. Truth, he said, is not a crown you wear. It's a burden you carry. The line was meant to be a showstopper, poetic, bold, and reflective, but it drew no reaction. Instead, several attendees shifted in their chairs. One was seen glancing at their phone. Another, according to an eyewitness in the 5th row, visibly winced. Then came the turning point, the line that has since been clipped, dissected, and replayed endlessly across social media and cable news. In a world drowning in lies, it is those of us who still believe in truth who must rise. And then the pause. A long pause. Or at least, it felt long. In real time, it was approximately 2.4 seconds, but in the context of public speaking, especially one so carefully choreographed, it was an eternity. It was not a pause for breath or reflection. It was a pause built for applause. And it didn't come. What followed in that pause was not just silence, but the unmistakable shift in mood. Harry, realizing the audience had not followed his cue, visibly stiffened. The next line, which was meant to soar, something about truth being the compass that guides nations through chaos, came out rushed, as though he wanted to bulldoze past the moment. The second section, Courage, attempted to recover. Here, Harry discussed mental health struggles, both personal and global. He referenced veterans, young people battling anxiety in the digital age, and whistleblowers who faced retaliation. He spoke of bravery not as the absence of fear, but as the decision to stand firm in the presence of it. But once again, the speech began to feel more like a motivational lecture than a call to action. He sounded like a TED Talk that was 3 years too late, said one attendee, a gender equality activist from Mumbai. The metaphors were heavy, the pacing was theatrical, but the substance felt thin. This was especially evident in his third segment, Responsibility, which was supposed to be the heart of the speech. Here, Harry was expected to lay out his vision for what changemakers could do next. Instead, what came was a blend of general statements. We must be stewards of truth in every boardroom. Each of us carries the torch of accountability. No movement thrives unless rooted in authenticity. These phrases, though elegant on paper, lacked weight when delivered without specific context or examples. Attendees were left wondering, what does this actually mean? How do we operationalize this? Is this just rhetoric? Or is there a plan? The final section, Legacy, attempted to tie it all together. This was where Harry spoke about his children. He described watching Archie and Lilibet play, reflecting on what kind of world they'd inherit. He said, "When I look into their eyes, I see both a past I can't change and a future I must fight for." It was emotional, personal. The tone shifted. But again, the audience remained quiet. In most public speaking environments, particularly those where celebrity is involved, audiences often react more to personality than content. But the NEXUS audience, as previously mentioned, is different. They're composed of policy analysts, entrepreneurs, field workers, scientists, and grassroots organizers. They operate in data, in prototypes, in interventions. They don't clap for beautifully delivered emotion unless it's tethered to something concrete, something they can act on or relate to. By the end of the speech, there was some polite applause, scattered, obligatory. Harry stepped back from the podium, offered a brief nod, and exited stage left without taking questions. Many in the audience were still silent. Within moments, the analysis began. The primary critique that emerged wasn't about tone or delivery. It was about relevance. Attendees, commentators, and later, online critics questioned whether Harry understood who he was speaking to. Was he delivering a message designed for Oprah's couch, for fans of his memoir, for Netflix viewers? Or did he truly grasp the urgency and pragmatism demanded by the NEXUS community? Even more troubling was the sense that the speech had been tailored to generate applause at predictable intervals, a performance, rather than a conversation. The problem wasn't that he expected applause, said one summit speaker afterward. It was that he built his speech around it. In reviewing the transcript, several journalists and analysts noted the formulaic structure, personal anecdote, dramatic phrase, thematic declaration, and emotional payoff. It was polished, yes, but also robotic, predictable. As one behavioral communication expert wrote in her column the following day, Harry's speech felt like it had been run through a PR machine one too many times. It lost its soul. Others were more sympathetic. He's been through a lot, wrote a British columnist for The Guardian. And he's trying. But what this moment showed is that the currency of trauma doesn't last forever. Eventually, people want receipts. Receipts. That's the word that stuck. In the world of global change, people want action. Not just vision, not just vulnerability, but proof. What initiatives are you funding? What policies are you proposing? What tools are you offering? In the absence of these, even the most eloquent speech can feel like fluff. In the days that followed, Harry's speech became the centerpiece of conversations about celebrity activism. Had the public grown numb to stories of privileged suffering? Was the appetite for royal redemption gone? Or had Harry simply misread the room? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. The speech had failed to do what it set out to do. And in that failure, laid bare by silence, a new narrative emerged. Not of a prince forging a new path, but of a man struggling to reclaim relevance in a world that no longer offers applause simply because of who you are. They say silence speaks louder than words. At the 2025 NEXUS Global Summit, it didn't just speak, it roared. What should have been a routine moment of audience acknowledgement during Prince Harry's keynote speech turned into an unspoken referendum. A collective, involuntary judgment made not through boos or walkouts, but through something far more brutal, an audience's decision not to respond at all. In the moments immediately following Harry's dramatic pause, that long, expectant pause after the line about rising for truth, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't sudden chaos. There were no gasps, no murmurs of scandal, but there was a shift, a collective awareness. Eyebrows raised, back straightened in chairs, eyes flicked from one person to the next, silently asking, "Are we supposed to clap? Did we miss something?" The ballroom, lit with soft white light and framed by shimmering gold drapes, seemed to grow colder. Tension, once hidden beneath polite professionalism, began to surface. And Harry, now caught in a moment that felt like it stretched for an eternity, quickly pressed forward, abandoning the rhythmic flow that had guided the first half of his address. He stumbled, only slightly, but it was enough. And the audience noticed. What followed was the kind of real-time reaction that no PR team can spin. Attendees began adjusting in their seats. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, as if squinting through the tension. One woman in a green pantsuit, seated 3 rows from the front, looked at her neighbor with a faint expression of disbelief, a raised eyebrow, and a barely perceptible shake of the head. A prominent climate finance advisor in the second row glanced briefly at his smartwatch. These were not dramatic gestures, but subtle ones. Quiet markers of disengagement. And it wasn't just one person. It was dozens, then hundreds. The silence became communal. One attendee, a tech investor from San Francisco who asked not to be named, described the moment bluntly. "It felt like we were all suddenly part of a social experiment," she said. Everyone looked at each other, like, "Is this happening? We didn't mean to not clap. We just didn't feel it. Another attendee, a nonprofit executive from South Africa, echoed that sentiment. He gave us a line that sounded like it was written for applause. You could tell. The pause was practiced. The problem was, we didn't feel moved. We felt managed. That idea, that Harry's speech felt more like a performance than a moment of genuine engagement, was repeated over and over in the hours and days that followed. But in those immediate moments, what mattered was the body language. Take the delegation from Sweden. Seated near the center, they had arrived early, eager to engage with speakers from across sectors. But when the moment came for applause, their delegation leader merely nodded once, then leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His team followed suit. Not a clap among them. One of the most telling responses came from a young female activist from Brazil, who had herself spoken earlier in the day on the dangers of extractive mining in the Amazon. When asked later about Harry's pause, she didn't criticize directly. Instead, she smiled politely and said, "Maybe it's time we stop clapping for royalty and start clapping for courage." That phrase, "stop clapping for royalty," would later be quoted in numerous articles, gaining traction as a kind of unofficial summary of what had happened. Not everyone was cold. A small handful of attendees near the back did offer a brief, quiet clap, one of those unsure, tentative responses born more out of social courtesy than inspiration. But it quickly died down. The moment had already passed. The seating layout of the room, usually irrelevant in most speeches, took on symbolic meaning. Closer to the stage, where VIPs, donors, and media representatives sat, the silence was most palpable. In the back, with university fellows, scholarship invitees, and junior partners, there was more chatter, more murmuring. Not disrespectful, but skeptical. People whispered their thoughts under their breath, careful not to be seen breaking decorum. According to one staffer working the side stage area, members of Harry's team watching from backstage immediately realized something had gone wrong. You could feel the panic, the staffer said. The mood just plummeted. Someone mouthed, "Why didn't they clap?" Another one looked down at the floor and didn't look up for the rest of the speech. What makes this moment so compelling and so painful is how it unfolded in real time. It wasn't a delayed realization. It was instantaneous. The crowd, collectively, decided not to participate in the expected rhythm. No one booed. No one laughed. But no one celebrated either. One particularly sharp moment came as Harry attempted to power through, arriving at a second emotionally loaded phrase meant to inspire. "The stories we carry aren't chains, they are torches," he said, waiting for some reaction. Again, nothing. A student from Senegal, sitting with other young innovators, was seen whispering to the person next to her, lips moving slowly. "Is this poetry night?" The commentary wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was honest. It reflected the cognitive dissonance between the carefully curated language of the speech and the lived reality of those in the room. For many, the issues Harry referenced, truth, mental health, social justice, were not abstract ideas. They were real, immediate, and rooted in daily struggle. When someone speaks to those issues without grounding them in lived experience or real-world initiatives, it feels detached. "I don't doubt he believes what he said," another attendee remarked later. But belief alone isn't enough anymore. What compounded the discomfort in the room was that the summit had, earlier that same day, heard from speakers whose authenticity was not in question. A refugee who built a solar-powered school in a Syrian camp. A paraplegic entrepreneur from Kenya who created a job-matching platform for disabled youth. A woman from Detroit who turned her neighborhood's abandoned lots into urban farms and taught 300 children how to grow their own food. Compared to these voices, Harry's keynote, though polished, came across as distant, vague, almost ornamental. The contrast was unflattering, and the room reflected that truth without saying a word. Back in the media zone, journalists and freelance reporters noticed the shift too. One writer from a major U.S. outlet jotted down in the margin of her notebook, "Expected thunder." Got a shrug. In the lobby during the following break, the moment became the dominant topic of hushed conversation. People gathered in small clusters. Some laughed awkwardly. Others debated what it meant. A few offered sympathetic takes. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he expected a different kind of crowd, but the consensus was already forming. The moment had missed its mark. The silence, ironically, became the most reported moment of the entire summit. Later that evening, at the post-summit reception, the topic still lingered. A live DJ played in the background. Waitstaff passed around trays of champagne. But everywhere you turned, someone was referencing the pause. In a private conversation overheard near the bar, two influential philanthropists were discussing speaker effectiveness. One, a major donor from Singapore, said plainly, "You know who got a standing ovation today? The girl from Myanmar. She risked her life to be here. Harry gave us poetry and expected worship." Even those trying to be diplomatic struggled to deny the impact of the silence. A senior summit organizer, when asked what she thought of the moment, replied after a long pause of her own, "I think it's a learning experience for everyone, especially for people used to applause." That's what the silence revealed. Not anger or disrespect, but something perhaps more difficult to confront, a shift, a changing of the guard, not in the royal sense, but in the cultural sense. Influence is no longer guaranteed by lineage or visibility. It must be earned again and again, especially in spaces where people have bled for their causes. And in that room, in that moment, the silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was a quiet refusal to validate a message that hadn't been tailored to the people listening. Harry, to his credit, finished his speech. He didn't walk off prematurely. He didn't break down, but his posture changed. The confidence that had carried him through the opening minutes softened. The pacing of his voice lost its rhythm. His hand gestures became more cautious, less expansive. By the time he reached the final lines about his children and the world they would inherit, he seemed less like a leader commanding a room, and more like a man reading lines that had once meant something, but now felt far away. And when he walked off stage, there was applause. But it wasn't the rousing, room-shaking kind. It was polite, respectful, distant, not hostile, but not warm either. That moment, frozen now in clips and memes, became something more than an awkward beat in a speech. It became symbolic, a moment of transition, a turning point in how the world receives Harry's message, and perhaps a warning about the limits of reputation. In the world of high-stakes leadership and purpose-driven influence, silence is never neutral. It says something. And at the 2025 NEXUS Global Summit, it said, "Not today." Backstage at the NEXUS Global Summit was a world of its own. Separate from the sleek, high-ceiling ballrooms where speeches were delivered and connections made, the backstage area buzzed with a different energy. It was less curated, more chaotic. There were staff members coordinating mic levels, interns running coffee to senior panelists, and PR teams huddled in corners managing speaker schedules. But on the day of Prince Harry's keynote, the usually well-oiled machine started to tense up long before he ever stepped to the podium. His entrance into the backstage area was unannounced but not unnoticed. Harry arrived through a private side entrance just over an hour before his scheduled time slot. He was flanked by 3 aides from the Archwell Foundation and 2 private security officers dressed in dark suits. A silence fell over the hallway where speakers were usually ushered in with casual conversation. He wasn't wearing a crown, but his aura, and the attention he commanded, made the moment unmistakably royal. One NEXUS staffer who had volunteered to coordinate green room access described the moment. "Everything just kind of stopped," she recalled. People straightened up. There was a change in posture from everyone. Even the usual summit chaos kind of paused for a beat. Harry was ushered into a holding suite reserved for VIP keynote speakers, a quiet, tastefully decorated space with minimalist furniture, filtered water, and a private monitor showing the live event feed. He reportedly declined the offer for food or refreshments. Instead, according to a producer who had been tasked with keeping him informed of scheduling changes, he paced slowly across the room, reviewing his notes, then standing silently with his hands in his pockets for long stretches of time. He seemed calm, the producer said, but not relaxed, like he had something to prove. In the final 15 minutes before his appearance, a speech coach who had worked with Archwell's communications team joined him for a last-minute review. The coach, known for working with high-level corporate executives and media figures, reportedly walked him through the cadence and pacing of the speech. Sources backstage later said the infamous pause, the one Harry would later take mid-speech, expecting applause, was one of the emphasized dramatic beats they practiced. "They timed it out," said a summit staffer who overheard the discussion. "They knew exactly where he'd pause, how long he'd hold it, and how to follow it up. It was all rehearsed." And that, according to some who witnessed the rehearsal, was where the first cracks began to show. One advisor for another keynote speaker remarked later that the speech seemed overmanaged even in the practice phase. "It was like watching someone act out inspiration rather than feel it," they said. Everything was performative, down to the tilt of the head, the pause for breath, the way he touched the podium. As the clock ticked down, the control room relayed a 5-minute warning to Harry's team. His aides responded by adjusting his lapel mic and ensuring the teleprompter was ready with the most recent script. One technician recalled how unusually specific the directions were. They asked for the text to be set in a particular font at a precise speed. They were treating this like a filmed shoot. Then came the walk to the stage. Harry exited the green room, flanked by his staff and security, walking a short corridor past rows of equipment, coiled cables, and frantic production assistants. Cameras were positioned to capture his side profile for the livestream. 2 stagehands nodded respectfully as he passed. The mood was reverent, but the kind of reverence that didn't feel earned so much as expected. "He had this gravity about him," said one stagehand, "but I'm not sure if it was awe or just everyone not wanting to offend him." The final cue came. A producer held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. A spotlight flicked on, and Prince Harry stepped onto the stage. What happened next has already been covered in depth. The speech, the pause, the silence, and the palpable discomfort that settled in the ballroom like a thick fog. But it's what happened the moment he returned backstage that truly pulled back the curtain on what this moment meant for him. The walk-off stage was fast. Too fast, according to one event planner who was stationed at the edge of the stage. "He didn't wait for anyone," she said. "He just headed straight back, eyes forward, jaw clenched." Backstage, a staff member had been waiting with a bottle of water. Harry ignored it. One of his aides tried to say something, likely a line of comfort or encouragement, but he waved them off with a curt flick of his wrist. His expression was unmistakable, irritation tempered by public restraint. "He looked furious," said a Summit volunteer who had been gathering wireless mics in the hallway. Not full-blown angry, but clearly rattled. Inside the green room, doors were quickly shut. Only his inner circle remained. But even there, the mood was tense. According to someone who was assisting with VIP transport, raised voices were heard through the walls. Not yelling, but heated exchanges, the unmistakable cadence of a frustrated man demanding answers. He was upset about the audience, one insider revealed. He kept saying, "Why didn't they clap?" That line was written for them. And then something like, "I've delivered this better in rehearsal." What happened? At one point, he reportedly threw his speech notes on the table. Aides tried to regroup, suggesting the audience may have been tired, distracted, or thrown off by the day's earlier emotional presentations. But Harry wasn't buying it. He said something like, "They wanted me to fail." That really stuck with me, the same source added. His security team began preparing for an early departure. Originally, Harry was scheduled to stay for a brief private lunch with a small group of speakers, followed by a closed-door session with Summit leaders to discuss philanthropic partnerships. Both were abruptly canceled. Rachel Garrell, who had personally invited Harry to speak, was reportedly blindsided. According to one of her assistants, she attempted to approach Harry backstage, only to be told he had left for his vehicle. "He didn't even wait for the rest of the session to end," said a staff member monitoring the exits. "It was like he couldn't get out of there fast enough." The SUV waiting for Harry idled for just over 10 minutes before pulling away. His aides, looking pale and professionally strained, followed in a second vehicle. And just like that, he was gone. But the impact of what happened lingered. In the hours after his departure, chatter about the backstage fallout spread through the production teams, catering staff, and security details. Everyone had their own version of the story. Some claimed Harry looked like he was about to cry. Others said he was simply shell-shocked. A few speculated that someone would be fired from his PR team before the week was out. There was also the question of how the speech would be remembered. Would it be spun into a misunderstood moment? Would Archwell release a statement claiming the crowd was actually moved into silent reflection? Would clips be carefully edited before being distributed through official channels? By the next day, it was clear that damage control had begun. Journalists who requested a copy of the speech were sent a transcript, one that omitted the pause entirely and made minor adjustments to wording. A social media post from the Archwell Foundation referred to Harry's appearance as an inspiring keynote on truth and leadership. No mention of the reception, no clips of the crowd. And yet, behind the scenes, it was obvious that Harry's team had been rattled. Internally, there were meetings, long calls, and crisis evaluations. Advisors debated whether future appearances should be less scripted or even postponed altogether. One former royal staffer, now working in the nonprofit world, summed it up best in a private message to a colleague. "He's used to walking into rooms that are already cheering. This time, he walked into one that expected more than a name." The failure backstage wasn't just about missed applause. It was about misjudging the moment, the audience, the venue, the context, and even the timing. And Harry, for all his good intentions, learned that no amount of practice or polish can force a room to feel something it doesn't. As for the rest of the summit, the show went on. Other speakers took the stage. Conversation shifted. But the shadow of Harry's silence hung over the event like a fog that wouldn't quite lift. In the days that followed, a question repeated itself across media circles and philanthropic networks alike. What happens when a man so used to being heard is met instead with a silence so loud it echoes backstage? The fallout from Prince Harry's awkward speech pause at the 2025 NEXUS Global Summit quickly rippled through royal watchers, public relations analysts, media pundits, and even psychologists. Within 48 hours, the incident was being dissected from every angle, not just as a momentary misstep, but as a prism through which deeper questions about Harry's public identity could be explored. Was it royal ego, the last flickers of a man raised to expect applause? Or was it something more complex, something more human, the desperate desire to still be heard, to matter, to be understood in a world that may have already moved on? The question wasn't rhetorical. It required real analysis. And experts were eager to weigh in. First came the royal commentators. The cadre of seasoned journalists, authors, and biographers who have made careers out of interpreting every movement, phrase, and silence from the House of Windsor. Ingrid Reynolds, a longtime royal analyst for British television, gave her assessment the morning after the summit. What we saw, she said, was the result of a man caught between worlds. He's no longer a working royal, yet he still expects the kind of emotional response that comes with royal gravity. That room didn't know him that. Reynolds went further, suggesting that Harry's failure to read the room was indicative of a larger problem, one shared by several celebrities who step into activist and philanthropic spaces. It's not enough to be famous anymore. You must be relevant. You must be humble. You must understand the mood of the room. What worked in 2020 won't work in 2025. Other experts focused on the psychological underpinnings of Harry's expectations. Dr. Maya Harland, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and public personas, offered a different interpretation. We have to remember that this is a man who, from childhood, was conditioned to associate his presence with public reaction, she explained in an interview on a popular morning news program. When you're applauded simply for arriving somewhere for most of your life, you internalize that feedback loop. The absence of that response isn't just disappointing. It can feel like rejection on a personal level. Adler pointed out that many modern audiences, especially those involved in social impact, have grown weary of celebrity speeches that lack substance. We live in an era of extreme scrutiny. You can't fake authenticity. You can't manipulate applause. It has to be earned in real time. He drew comparisons to public figures who had successfully transitioned from positions of inherited power to earned influence. People like Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Malala Yousafzai. What do they do differently? They ground their speeches in lived experience and outcomes. They don't just emote. They deliver. This sentiment was echoed by one of Harry's former allies in the philanthropic world, speaking off record. I think he's a good person. I really do, the source said. But he's been living in a vacuum, surrounded by people who hype every move, who tell him every speech is powerful. Sometimes you need someone to say, no, that won't land with this crowd. And then came the conversation about royal ego. To some, it was undeniable. The expectation of applause, especially after a line so clearly choreographed to prompt it, felt less like an organic moment of inspiration and more like a performance, a rehearsed crescendo. And when the room didn't play along, Harry's frustration was visible. He's used to walking into a room and being the center of gravity, said Olivia Thorne, editor of a magazine that tracks global leadership trends. But at NEXUS, everyone is the center of gravity in their own world. You've got 22-year-olds building irrigation systems in Sudan. You've got venture capitalists who've bankrolled vaccine distribution. They don't care about who your grandmother was. They care about what you're doing now. Thorne added that the royal identity, once a powerful tool for opening doors and amplifying causes, now risks becoming a weight that drags down Harry's credibility. It's a complicated irony. The more he tries to step away from being a prince, the more he seems to expect to be treated like one. That contradiction of rejecting royalty while clinging to its privileges was the subtext many critics latched on to. There's something strange about denouncing the monarchy in one breath and expecting reverence in the next, said an editorial in a major New York newspaper. You can't have the crown and cast it off at the same time. Others were more sympathetic. Veteran journalist Helena Vargas suggested that Harry's miscalculation at NEXUS wasn't arrogance, but poor coaching. He's been overmanaged, she said. His team has tried to build a public persona out of grief, healing, and moral clarity. But they've stripped him of spontaneity. That room needed sincerity. What it got was stagecraft. To support her claim, Vargas pointed to other speakers at the summit who moved audiences not with polished delivery, but with rawness. Nervous stutters, tearful pauses, imperfect but deeply personal stories. They weren't perfect, but they were real. That's what landed. Even so, not everyone blamed Harry or his team. A smaller group of commentators questioned whether the audience itself was too harsh. You can't demand vulnerability and then punish it, tweeted one popular activist. He showed up. He spoke his truth. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but the silence felt mean. The tweet sparked debate. Was the audience cold? Or were they simply holding Harry to the same standard they held everyone else? That debate didn't end in consensus, but it raised a critical point. Public figures like Harry are in a bind. If they speak candidly, they risk criticism for being self-indulgent. If they speak broadly, they're dismissed as vague. If they seek applause, they're called egotistical. If they don't, they're accused of being disengaged. And yet, despite the multiple layers of interpretation, one truth remained consistent. Harry's pause, and the room's refusal to respond, reflected a disconnect. A mismatch between expectation and reality. A chasm between performance and perception. And perhaps most importantly, a signal that his messaging, however sincere, is no longer immune to scrutiny. Whether this moment becomes a turning point depends largely on how Harry responds. Will he recalibrate? Will he listen to the silence and adjust his message? Or will he double down on the narrative he's been building? As Dr. Harlan pointed out, growth isn't in the applause. It's in what you do when it doesn't come. In the end, the silence wasn't just a failure of applause. It was a feedback loop, one more honest than any standing ovation. And for a man who spent the last several years trying to be understood on his own terms, it may be the most important moment of truth yet. By the time Prince Harry's NEXUS Global Summit speech concluded and the clips began circulating online, it was no longer just a moment confined to a silent ballroom. It had become a public event, but not the kind of event Harry's team likely envisioned. Instead of thought leaders sharing his quotes with admiration or activist communities hailing his courage, the internet responded with a potent mixture of mockery, confusion, and critique. The backlash began swiftly, fueled by the now infamous moment where Harry paused for applause and received nothing but a wall of silence. Social media, as always, was the first battlefield. Within an hour of the clip being uploaded by a summit attendee on TikTok, it had garnered over 3 million views. The caption was simple and damning. He waited, we didn't clap. The clip itself was barely 8 seconds long, just Harry's dramatic delivery of the line. It is those of us who still believe in truth who must rise, followed by his extended pause, a brief flicker of expectation in his eyes, and then a cut to the crowd sitting motionless, some blinking, others shifting in their chairs, no hands moving to applaud. Comments poured in at a dizzying rate. Some were humorous, POV. You just realized nobody's clapping for your trauma monologue, while others were biting. This is what happens when you confuse privilege for purpose. Memes quickly took over Instagram and X, formerly Twitter, with users inserting Harry's speech pause into everything from sitcom laugh tracks to scenes of tumbleweeds rolling across deserts. The audio clip of the silence became a meme template, with other users inserting the pause into their own moments of awkwardness. But beyond the jokes, there was real commentary beginning to take shape. One of the earliest serious critiques came from a well-known Gen Z activist, Jamie Keller, who posted a thread titled, "Why Harry's Silence Matters More Than His Speech." In it, Keller broke down the mismatch between message and messenger. The truth is, we've heard these themes before, over and over, from Harry, from others like him. Truth, authenticity, legacy. It's not that those aren't important, it's that they've been reduced to buzzwords by people who don't follow them with action. Keller's thread was widely shared, particularly among young professionals and organizers within global development spaces. Her final point landed hardest. You can't make a career out of healing publicly and expect everyone else to clap forever. Eventually, they want to know, what did you build? Who did you save? What changed because you spoke? This wasn't just a reaction to a speech. It was a collective judgment on Harry's brand of advocacy, one that, at least for some, now felt performative and tired. Articles began rolling out across major platforms by the end of the day. The Guardian's headline was subtle but cutting: a pause, a silence, and a shift. Prince Harry's NEXUS speech misfires. In it, columnist Aisha Patel wrote, "This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a breakdown. It was something harder to ignore: irrelevance." Her piece argued that Harry's message didn't provoke outrage because it didn't provoke anything at all. Other international media outlets were less diplomatic. A German newspaper described the speech as a self-congratulatory monologue lacking in urgency or grounding. A French commentary said simply, "The prince came to inspire but forgot to listen." On American television, late-night talk shows wasted no time. One host quipped, "Prince Harry paused for applause and got ghosted by an entire room full of humanitarians. That's like bombing at your own birthday party." Another joked, "Even the teleprompter looked disappointed." These jokes, while predictable, signaled something deeper. Harry was now a punchline, not just a presence. Even former supporters of the Sussexes began to distance themselves from the moment. Popular podcast hosts who had previously praised Harry and Meghan for breaking away from the royal family now questioned whether their activism had become more spectacle than substance. "When did they become the people who talk about change more than they make it?" asked one host. That pause, that awkward silence, was the sound of a movement stalling. To complicate matters further, the backlash wasn't limited to Harry's critics. It began creeping into his own support base, the core group of followers who had championed his mental health advocacy, his exit from royal constraints, and his vulnerability. Even among those who once defended him, there were now questions about why the speech felt empty. A well-known Black British journalist, long sympathetic to Harry and Meghan, wrote a particularly scathing column. "We defended Harry when he said the royal institution was suffocating. We believed him when he spoke about losing his mother and the media's cruelty. But now, in 2025, what exactly is he offering? Not courage, not leadership, just curated sorrow." One particular quote from the column went viral: "Silence is not always indifference. Sometimes it's disappointment." In many ways, the backlash wasn't just about what Harry said or didn't say. It was about what people expected from him and what he failed to deliver. The public backlash also triggered private conversations within nonprofit and philanthropic circles. Organizations that had once viewed Harry as an ideal spokesperson for mental health, environmental issues, and post-trauma recovery began to reassess. Several industry insiders claimed that some boards and event planners were now quietly debating whether to continue aligning with him. There was a time when adding Harry to your campaign guaranteed media coverage and donor attention, one nonprofit executive shared. Now, you have to ask, is he going to overshadow the cause? Or worse, dilute it? Public image consultants also began weighing in. Within the PR world, the post-NEXUS fallout became a case study. One firm released an anonymous review titled "The Dangers of Narrative Overload," suggesting that Harry's reliance on his personal story had reached saturation. "He has told his truth repeatedly. Now people want action. If you keep hitting the same emotional notes, people stop listening." Another publicist offered a harsher assessment. The pause was the most honest moment in the speech. It showed that Harry still expects the world to stop for him. The world doesn't. Not anymore. The criticism wasn't just from professionals and thought leaders. Everyday people joined the conversation. Social media polls ran informal surveys. Was Harry's speech out of touch? Is the Sussex brand losing steam? The results leaned heavily towards skepticism. One particularly harsh but viral comment read, "He left the palace to find freedom, but now he wants the world to treat him like he's still on the balcony at Buckingham." The backlash also extended to questions about authenticity. Viewers picked apart every detail of the speech: the rehearsed gestures, the overly poetic language, the pause that felt like it belonged in a Shakespeare monologue, not a summit about global impact. Critics said it was more about style than substance, more performance than partnership. This interpretation was reinforced by body language experts who appeared on morning talk shows and YouTube commentary channels. They analyzed Harry's stance, tone, and facial expressions. Several noted the micro-expressions of frustration and confusion that appeared when applause didn't come. "It's clear," said one analyst. "He was waiting for something he thought was guaranteed." But in a room filled with doers, activists, innovators, scientists, organizers, that guarantee had expired. Perhaps most damning was the silence from Meghan. In the past, Meghan had often appeared to publicly support her husband following tough media cycles, usually through a statement, social media post, or scheduled appearance designed to soften the press narrative. But after the NEXUS incident, she remained silent. Some wondered if she had advised against the speech altogether. Others speculated that the couple's strategy was undergoing a quiet recalibration. In the midst of the storm, Harry himself remained quiet as well. No interviews, no follow-ups, no comments to press. His team issued only a standard thank you to NEXUS organizers for the opportunity to share in a meaningful conversation, but it did little to slow the backlash. At the prestigious 2025 NEXUS Global Summit, a room full of global changemakers went eerily silent as Prince Harry delivered what was meant to be a thunderous line about fighting for truth. But when he paused, clearly expecting applause, the room stared back, unmoved. What followed wasn't just awkward, it was a shocking unraveling of royal confidence in real time. Why did the audience refuse to clap? Was this a turning point in Harry's public credibility? And what happened backstage that left him reportedly seething and demanding answers? Stay with us as we unpack the silence that shook a summit and humiliated a prince.